The cook approached the millionaire and told him not to eat the food his wife had ordered to be served to him. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble home. Lydia adjusted her apron, straightened the collar of her white blouse, and tucked a stray curl behind her ear as she took a deep breath. The bustling kitchen of the Harper mansion was her domain, a space filled with the scents of simmering sauces, fresh herbs, and the faint heat from the ovens. She'd been working here for years, yet the grandiosity of the place still took her by surprise. Every room in the mansion sparkled with polish, elegance, and wealth that Lydia could hardly imagine. Edwin Harper, her employer, was a man of striking presence, though his immense fortune and reputation often preceded him. He treated Lydia and the rest of the staff with respect. This alone set him apart from many of the city's wealthy elites. He was polite, attentive, and genuinely appreciative of her culinary skills, which made Lydia's job feel more like a calling than simple employment. But ever since his marriage to Margaret Hale, a woman nearly half his age, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Margaret was beautiful, charming, and held a grace that suited her new title as Mrs. Harper. But Lydia could sense an edge beneath that polished exterior. Margaret's gaze was cold, assessing, and Lydia often felt as if she were under silent scrutiny whenever Margaret was around. One particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the pristine gardens outside, Lydia found herself alone in the kitchen. She was preparing the evening meal, carefully chopping vegetables and selecting the finest cuts of meat just as she turned to reach for the seasoning rack. She heard the click of heels entering the kitchen. Margaret's presence filled the room like a gust of cold wind. She was dressed elegantly, her sleek blonde hair swept back to reveal a pair of diamond earrings that sparkled under the kitchen lights. "Good evening, Lydia," Margaret said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I have a special request for tonight's dinner." Lydia looked up, nodding politely. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. What would you like?" Margaret moved closer, her voice dropping to a hushed tone as if she were sharing a secret. "I want you to add this to Edwin's meal," she said, slipping a small vial from her purse and placing it on the counter. The liquid inside was pale, nearly clear, with a faint shimmer that caught the light. Lydia's brows knit together in confusion. "Is there something specific you want to add, ma'am?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her tone curt and final. "Just a few drops will do. It's a special blend, a health supplement. You could say, it's something I've researched carefully. Edwin's been feeling a bit under the weather lately, and I want him to try it." Lydia hesitated, glancing at the vial. She'd been in the culinary field long enough to know when something was off, and this request struck her as odd. It wasn't uncommon for clients to have dietary preferences, but this felt different. The way Margaret's fingers lingered on the vial, her gaze cool and calculating, sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. "Is there something wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp, catching Lydia's hesitation. "No, ma'am," Lydia replied quickly, forcing a small smile. "I'll add it as you requested." Margaret's expression softened. "Good. You've always been loyal, Lydia. It's why I appreciate your work so much." With a satisfied nod, Margaret turned and left, the sound of her heels fading as she disappeared down the hall. Lydia stared at the vial on the counter, her mind racing. Something didn't sit right. Why had Margaret insisted on adding the substance herself, rather than asking the family doctor? Lydia's instincts, honed through years of working in other households, told her that whatever was in that vial might not be beneficial at all. As the minutes ticked by, Lydia wrestled with her thoughts. The right thing to do would be to follow Margaret's instructions. After all, she was just the cook, and Margaret was the lady of the house. But the idea of Edwin eating something with unknown ingredients gnawed at her. She'd seen how kindly he treated the staff, always asking how they were, always with a friendly smile. He didn't deserve whatever Margaret might be planning. When the dinner bell rang, Lydia took a deep breath and carried the tray to the grand dining room, where Edwin sat waiting. Margaret was nowhere in sight, likely still attending to other matters. Setting the plate down before him, Lydia lingered just a moment longer, and, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Mr. Harper, forgive me, but please, don't eat this. It's just a feeling, an intuition, if you will." Edwin's brow arched in curiosity. He was not the type to ignore the instincts of someone he trusted, and Lydia's quiet, pleading eyes told him enough. After a pause, he nodded, touching her hand lightly in gratitude. "Thank you, Lydia," he replied softly, his eyes showing both warmth and curiosity. That night, Lydia left the mansion feeling a weight pressing on her, yet a strange relief washed over her. The last thing she expected was that her simple warning would soon unravel a chain of events that would alter all their lives. The next morning, Lydia returned to work with the same calm, determined energy she carried every day. But this time, as she entered the kitchen, a sense of anticipation brewed in her chest. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Margaret's request from the night before wasn't over. Edwin had acknowledged her warning with a look of quiet understanding. But Lydia had no idea if he'd acted on her advice. As she began her morning routine, chopping vegetables and arranging ingredients for breakfast, she heard hurried footsteps approaching. Glancing up, she saw Edwin entering the kitchen, a rare occurrence in itself, his face serious yet grateful. He greeted her with a small, warm smile before beckoning her to step away from the staff's prying eyes. "Lydia," he began in a hushed tone, "I need to thank you for last night. I took your advice and didn't touch my meal. Afterward, I did some investigating of my own, and it turns out I'm glad I listened." Lydia felt her stomach tighten as she awaited his next words, unsure of what he might reveal. "I had a sample of that ingredient tested," he continued, lowering his voice even more. "It wasn't a health supplement. It was something much darker, something that could have harmed me." Edwin's words sent a chill through Lydia. Her fears were not just a figment of her imagination. Margaret, the very woman Edwin had chosen as his wife, had plotted to poison him. Lydia struggled to contain her shock, her eyes widening slightly, but she managed to maintain her composure as she met his gaze. "I had a feeling, sir," she replied quietly, choosing her words with care. "I didn't want to say anything outright, but something about the way Mrs. Harper insisted on that ingredient felt wrong." Edwin nodded, his gaze steady. "I owe you a great deal, Lydia, and I realize that I can't simply ignore this, but confronting Margaret openly, it could make things much worse. She's clever, and she would likely deny everything, maybe even turn the situation around on us." Lydia nodded in understanding. Despite her own quiet fear, she admired Edwin's calm approach to the matter. He wasn't one to act rashly. He wanted to gather all the facts before making a move. "Sir, is there anything you'd like me to do?" she asked, her voice steady. "Yes," he said, his tone softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay close, but keep to your duties as you normally would. I'll take care of any retaliation if Margaret becomes suspicious." The reassurance helped put Lydia's mind at ease, even as she understood the risk involved. Working in the Harper mansion had always been a steady, albeit intense, part of her life, but now it seemed her job had morphed into something far more dangerous. Later that day, Lydia busied herself in the kitchen, her hands deftly moving from task to task. She kept her mind focused on the chopping, stirring, and baking, but thoughts of the previous night weighed heavily on her. Margaret hadn't appeared all morning, and Lydia wondered if the plan to poison Edwin had been her last-ditch effort to secure his fortune. Perhaps she would attempt something else, something even more calculated. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden wave of footsteps as Margaret entered the kitchen. Looking striking as always, though her expression was noticeably tense, Lydia's instincts immediately sharpened. "Good morning, Lydia," Margaret greeted in a voice smooth as silk. "I trust everything is on schedule for the evening dinner." "Yes, Mrs. Harper. Everything is prepared as requested," Lydia replied calmly. Hiding any trace of unease, Margaret smiled, but there was a hardness to her eyes that Lydia couldn't ignore. "You know, Edwin has been rather peculiar lately. Distracted. I wonder if there's something he's been preoccupied with." Her gaze bored into Lydia's, an edge of suspicion in her voice. "I do hope he isn't too distracted by staff matters." Lydia held Margaret's gaze, forcing herself to remain calm. "I haven't noticed anything unusual, Mrs. Harper. Mr. Harper seems quite himself," she replied, hoping her tone sounded nonchalant. Margaret's smile tightened. "Good. Let's hope it stays that way." She lingered a moment longer, her sharp gaze scanning Lydia's face as if searching for a crack in her composure. As soon as Margaret turned and exited the kitchen, Lydia felt her entire body relax, realizing she'd been holding her breath. The encounter had rattled her, but she reminded herself of Edwin's words. She needed to remain steady, keep her head down, and avoid arousing further suspicion that evening. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lydia wrapped up her duties in the kitchen and prepared to leave. As she gathered her things, she felt a surge of mixed emotions: gratitude for Edwin's kindness and trust, but also a subtle, gnawing fear of what Margaret might be planning next. The woman was no stranger to manipulation. Lydia had witnessed it countless times, whether in the subtle corrections she made to Edwin's demeanor or in the quiet commands she gave to the staff. Stepping outside the mansion and breathing in the cool evening air, Lydia couldn't help but feel a strange foreboding. Her mind drifted back to Edwin's words that morning, and she understood the gravity of what he'd asked of her. Their alliance was one of secrecy and mutual respect, and any slip on her part could cost her everything. But just as she neared her modest home on the outskirts of the city, Lydia froze. A sleek, black luxury car was parked in front of her small gate. Gleaming under the dim streetlights, her pulse quickened as she cautiously approached, her gaze scanning the vehicle. The car door opened slowly, and to her astonishment, Edwin stepped out, his expression somber yet resolute. "Lydia," he said, his voice calm but serious. "I needed to speak with you again. I couldn't risk Margaret hearing a word of this, so I came to find you." The moment felt surreal. Here was Edwin Harper, her employer, a man of unimaginable wealth, standing outside her humble home, a concerned expression on his face. "Of course, Mr. Harper," Lydia replied, a note of nervousness in her voice. "What's happened?" He glanced around, then back at her, his voice low. "It's worse than I thought. I uncovered more evidence against Margaret. She was planning much more than what we initially suspected." Lydia's heart raced, a blend of fear and determination welling up within her. She'd committed to helping Edwin once, but now she realized there was no turning back. This discovery would be only the beginning. Lydia's heartbeat raced as she led Edwin into her modest home. The cozy, worn-out furniture, the small kitchen area, and the dim lighting all felt worlds apart from the Harper mansion's grandeur. She felt a mix of pride and embarrassment as Edwin took in his surroundings, his expression respectful and calm. Once inside, they both sat at her small kitchen table, the air heavy with unspoken concerns. Edwin took a steadying breath and looked at Lydia with a level of seriousness she hadn't seen before. "Lydia, I owe you an immense debt," he began, his voice low but filled with a genuine gratitude. "Your warning yesterday, it saved my life. I'm certain of it. But now that I've started digging, I realize this is only a small piece of what Margaret has planned." Lydia's hands tightened around the mug in front of her, her mind racing. "What did you find, Mr. Harper?" "Edwin," he corrected, his tone soft but firm. "If we're going to face this together, please call me Edwin." She nodded, acknowledging the unusual intimacy. "All right, Edwin. What did you discover?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I had some personal belongings examined, things Margaret thought I'd never notice. There were documents, forged signatures, accounts moved around without my knowledge. It's clear she's been siphoning money, but that's not the worst of it. I found evidence that she's been consulting with legal advisors about my will. She's been trying to position herself as my sole beneficiary." Lydia's eyes widened. "So, she intended to..." She couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too dark. Edwin's face hardened, confirming her suspicions. Yes, the poisoning attempt was only part of her plan. If she succeeded, she would have inherited everything, and no one would have suspected a thing, and given her persuasive charm. She could easily sway people to her side. Lydia sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of what Edwin had shared. Her mind replayed every encounter she'd had with Margaret, each moment sharpening into a clearer, more sinister picture. She could see now that Margaret's charm had masked a far more dangerous ambition. It wasn't just greed. It was a willingness to sacrifice anyone who stood in her way. "What do you plan to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. "I have to gather more evidence, more than enough to ensure she can't manipulate her way out of this, but it means I'll need help, and there's no one I trust more than you." The weight of his words settled over Lydia. Edwin's trust was both an honor and a burden, a responsibility she hadn't anticipated, but her loyalty to him and her own sense of justice made her nod without hesitation. I'll help however I can, Edwin. Margaret may hold power in some ways, but we have the truth on our side." Edwin's relief was visible. Was his shoulders relaxing as he looked at her with something close to gratitude, and something more, a glimmer of respect and admiration that softened his otherwise stern expression. "There's more," he continued, his tone cautious. "Margaret doesn't know that I'm on to her, but she suspects something. She's likely keeping tabs on you, trying to gauge any change in behavior." Lydia nodded, her mind already calculating ways to remain under Margaret's radar. "I'll be careful. I'll keep to my routines, keep my head down. She won't see anything unusual from me." Satisfied with her resolve, Edwin gave a small nod. "Good. I'll handle things from my end, piece by piece, until we can confront her with irrefutable proof." A knock at the door startled them both, breaking the tension-filled silence that had settled in the room. Lydia's heart pounded as she motioned for Edwin to stay hidden, her instincts kicking in. She approached the door carefully, half expecting to see Margaret herself standing on the other side. Instead, it was Mrs. Patel, her elderly neighbor, who offered a warm, if slightly curious, smile. "Evening, dear. I thought I saw someone unusual out here. Everything all right?" Lydia smiled politely, relieved but still wary. "Yes, Mrs. Patel, just a friend visiting." "Ah, I see," Mrs. Patel replied, glancing over her shoulder at the sleek car parked outside. "Quite the visitor you have there. Well, I'll let you be." Lydia watched as Mrs. Patel shuffled back to her house, waving as she went. She closed the door and returned to Edwin, who looked as tense as she felt. "We need to be even more discreet," Edwin remarked, his tone laced with concern. "Margaret might have people watching. The last thing I want is for you to be dragged into this." "Then we'll be careful," Lydia said firmly. "But I won't abandon you in this. Not after everything you've done for me." He seemed to take comfort in her words, a small, appreciative smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Lydia. Your loyalty. It means more to me than I can say." They spoke a while longer, discussing subtle strategies, crafting a plan that could be executed without alerting Margaret. Their alliance felt almost clandestine, a partnership born out of survival. But there was an unmistakable bond growing between them, a respect, a shared determination, and perhaps even a warmth neither had expected. When Edwin finally stood to leave, he offered her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll keep in touch, but please, be cautious. If Margaret suspects anything, we may lose our chance." Lydia nodded, understanding the precariousness of their situation. As she watched him walk back to his car, she felt a surge of strength. Whatever awaited them, she was prepared to face it by his side. As she closed the door, Lydia's thoughts buzzed with everything they'd discussed. Her life had been simple, even predictable. Until this turn of events now, she was woven into a dangerous web, but one with a glimmer of hope. The next morning, she returned to the Harper mansion with a calm determination. She moved through the kitchen as she always did, carrying out her duties with quiet focus. But she could feel Margaret's eyes on her at every turn, watching, waiting, calculating. Later in the day, as Lydia prepared lunch, Margaret entered the kitchen with a casual air that didn't fool Lydia for a second. "Good morning, Lydia. I hope you're keeping yourself busy," Margaret said, her tone cool and measured. "Yes, Mrs. Harper," Lydia replied with an even voice, her gaze not meeting Margaret's directly. Margaret smiled, but her eyes held a flicker of something darker. "Good. You're always such a reliable one, aren't you? Edwin is lucky to have you here." The words felt laced with warning, but Lydia kept her composure, giving a polite nod as Margaret turned and walked away. The encounter left Lydia unsettled, yet resolute. She had Edwin's trust, and she was committed to protecting him. As the days went on, she and Edwin exchanged fleeting glances, subtle nods that held unspoken promises. They would continue their quiet fight, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Lydia was determined to play her part in dismantling Margaret's deception. Their alliance had only just begun, and Lydia knew this was a path she couldn't turn back from. The days that followed passed in a tense silence, with Lydia sticking to her routines in the kitchen, keeping her head down, just as she'd promised Edwin. Each day, she'd feel Margaret's watchful eyes observing her every move, as if the woman were hoping to catch her in some kind of misstep. The atmosphere grew thicker, more charged, each passing hour carrying a sense of unease. Lydia could sense Margaret's simmering resentment growing. One evening, while finishing the dinner preparations, Lydia noticed Margaret's reflection in the polished steel of the kitchen appliances. Her entrance was smooth and controlled, yet her expression was one of barely contained fury. Lydia straightened, bracing herself as Margaret approached. "Lydia," Margaret began, her voice honeyed but dripping with malice. "I wanted to commend you on your dedication. It's rare to find such loyalty among the staff." Lydia forced herself to remain calm, offering Margaret a polite nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I take pride in my work." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Margaret replied, her gaze sharp as glass. "But let me be very clear, Lydia. Loyalty has its limits. I'd hate to see a hardworking woman like you become entangled in things that are, well, above her station." Lydia's heart pounded in her chest, but her face betrayed nothing. Margaret's words were laced with veiled threats, and Lydia knew she had to tread carefully. "Of course, ma'am, I understand." Margaret's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. You know, Edwin may seem generous, but he's quite vulnerable, and it's my duty to protect him, even if that means protecting him from the company he keeps." With that, Margaret turned on her heel and left, her heels clicking against the tile as she exited the kitchen. Lydia felt a chill settle over her. Margaret had made it clear. She saw Lydia as a threat, and she wouldn't hesitate to remove her if she felt it was necessary. The next day, tension simmered beneath the surface as Lydia resumed her duties, attempting to keep a low profile. But Margaret's fury wasn't so easily quelled. That afternoon, as Lydia organized the pantry shelves, she heard Margaret calling her from the hall. "Lydia, come here, I need a word with you." Lydia steadied herself and stepped out of the pantry, wiping her hands on her apron. Margaret stood near the dining room, her posture sharp and her expression cold. "Yes, Mrs. Harper," Lydia asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Last night, I noticed a few things were out of place." Margaret began, her tone accusatory. "A bracelet of mine went missing. It's rather valuable, and it wouldn't be the first time I've lost something around here." Lydia felt her throat tighten. Sensing where this was going, she'd never taken anything from the Harpers, let alone something as valuable as jewelry. But Margaret's eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that spoke volumes. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Harper," Lydia replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "I'll certainly help you look for it." Margaret raised a hand, dismissing Lydia's offer. "No need. I've already made up my mind. After all, you do spend a lot of time around the family's belongings, and I would hate to think of someone taking advantage of Edwin's kindness." The implication was clear. Margaret was setting up a trap to frame Lydia, hoping to discredit her in Edwin's eyes. Lydia stood her ground, refusing to let Margaret's words shake her. "I would never do such a thing, ma'am," she said firmly. "Mr. Harper has been nothing but generous, and I wouldn't betray his trust." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her lips curving into a smirk. "I'm sure you wouldn't, but just to be certain, I've asked Edwin to speak with you about this. I believe he'll be here shortly." The threat hung heavy in the air, and Lydia could feel the walls closing in around her. Margaret intended to humiliate her, to plant a seed of doubt in Edwin's mind. She could only hope that Edwin would see through Margaret's ploy. Moments later, Edwin entered the room, his face showing a mixture of surprise and concern as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" "Edwin," Margaret began, her voice soft and syrupy. "I didn't want to bother you, but it seems that a piece of my jewelry has gone missing and, well, I can't help but notice that Lydia has been spending quite a bit of time around my things. I thought it best if we addressed this directly." Edwin's gaze flickered to Lydia, his expression calm yet guarded. "Lydia," he said, his tone steady, "is there any truth to this?" Lydia felt the weight of his question, knowing that her answer could determine her future in this house. She took a deep breath and met his gaze head-on. "Mr. Harper, I would never take anything from you or Mrs. Harper. I value my work here, and I value the trust you've placed in me." Edwin studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned back to Margaret. "I don't see why we need to jump to conclusions, Margaret. Perhaps the bracelet was simply misplaced." Margaret's face tightened, her frustration barely concealed. "Oh, I'm sure Lydia is quite capable of defending herself, but you can't deny that this is suspicious." Edwin, as your wife, I feel it's my duty to protect our household from any unfortunate missteps. Lydia bit her lip, fighting back a surge of anger. Margaret's words were a blatant attempt to undermine her, to sow doubt where there should be none. But Edwin remained calm, his gaze shifting back to Lydia. Thank you, Margaret, but I think we can handle this differently, Lydia. Please go about your work as usual. We'll discuss this later if necessary. Reluctantly, Margaret nodded, but her eyes shot daggers at Lydia as she left the room, her frustration palpable. Lydia held her breath until she was certain Margaret was gone, then turned to Edwin. Thank you, Mr. Harper, she said softly, her voice laced with gratitude. He gave her a small nod, his expression thoughtful. Don't let Margaret's words trouble you, Lydia. I trust you completely. The reassurance settled over Lydia like a warm blanket. Yet she knew Margaret wouldn't give up so easily. The woman's fury was like a storm brewing on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As Lydia returned to her duties, she realized that her simple warning to Edwin had ignited something far greater than she'd anticipated. Margaret's anger wasn't just a fleeting emotion. It was a calculated, simmering resentment, one that wouldn't be satisfied until she had succeeded in removing Lydia from the mansion and Edwin's trust. For the rest of the day, Lydia went about her tasks with a new resolve. She was no stranger to hard work or to difficult people, but Margaret was a challenge she'd never encountered before. It was a battle that required caution, patience, and above all, resilience. As she watched Edwin from afar, Lydia silently promised herself that she wouldn't let Margaret's schemes drive her away. She would stand by him, and together, they would face whatever darkness Margaret harbored. But she knew that the days ahead would only grow more treacherous. And Margaret's fury had only just begun. In the days following Margaret's attempt to frame Lydia, Edwin seemed even more determined to uncover the truth. Lydia's loyalty and courage had become a silent but unbreakable bond between them, one that no accusation or scheme could shake. The kitchen had always been her safe space, but now it felt more like the calm center in a gathering storm. Each glance from Margaret, every clipped word, reminded Lydia that she was treading dangerous ground. One afternoon, as Lydia was preparing the day's lunch, Edwin appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression thoughtful and somewhat guarded. He cast a quick glance around, ensuring they were alone before stepping in. "Lydia," he said in a low voice, "do you have a moment?" She nodded, drying her hands on her apron as she moved to a quiet corner of the kitchen with him. The hum of activity in the rest of the house provided a cloak of privacy. "I've made some progress," Edwin began, his tone careful. "I had a trusted advisor review the evidence Margaret tried to manipulate. She's been covering her tracks well, but not perfectly. We found some discrepancies in her account activities that can't be ignored." Lydia's heart raced at his words. "That's good news, isn't it?" Edwin nodded. "It is, but it also means she's going to become more suspicious of us. She's clever, Lydia. She senses when things aren't going her way. I suspect she's keeping a closer eye on you now." The weight of his words settled over her. Lydia had always tried to be discreet, but she knew Margaret's calculating nature. There was no telling what else she might attempt to discredit Lydia and protect herself. Edwin's voice softened, his gaze steady. "I wanted to tell you this in person, Lydia, because I need your help more than ever. Margaret may have resources, but I have something she'll never understand. Trust." Lydia felt a surge of warmth at his words. Despite the dangers they faced, "Whatever you need, Edwin, I'll be here." He offered her a faint smile, an unspoken promise of solidarity between them. "Thank you, Lydia. I can't tell you how much that means to me." The quiet resolve in his voice gave her strength, and as they shared a brief, understanding glance, Lydia knew that their alliance was now unbreakable. No matter what Margaret tried, Lydia would stand by Edwin's side. Later that evening, as the staff prepared the mansion for a small gathering, Lydia went about her duties with a careful composure. She knew Margaret would be watching, waiting for any slip-up, any reason to cast doubt on her loyalty. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the weight of hidden agendas lurking beneath the polished surface of the Harper estate. While setting up the dining room, Lydia noticed Edwin speaking with a few guests, his expression relaxed but attentive. The guests appeared to be close friends or longtime associates, people who Edwin trusted. Lydia felt a slight pang, knowing that even among his trusted circle, Edwin was living under a shadow of deceit cast by his own wife. As the evening wore on, Lydia kept herself busy in the kitchen, carefully plating dishes and ensuring everything was flawless. She focused on the rhythm of her work, her hands steady and her mind calm, despite the awareness that Margaret could enter at any moment with another threat or accusation. Just as she finished arranging the final dish, Edwin entered the kitchen again, his face tight with concern. "Lydia," he said softly, I think it's time we start putting things into action. Margaret suspects something, and if we don't act soon, she might attempt another drastic measure." Lydia nodded, understanding the urgency. "What do you have in mind?" Edwin hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was within earshot. "Margaret isn't just after money. She's seeking power, control, everything that this family name holds. If we expose her without solid proof, she could twist things in her favor and come out stronger. So we gather more evidence," Lydia replied, her voice steady. "What kind of proof are we looking for?" Edwin sighed, his face lined with the stress of their predicament. "We need concrete documentation of her financial maneuvers, records of her attempts to change my will. It's risky, but if we're careful, we can retrieve what we need without alerting her." The plan was risky, but Lydia's mind was set. "I can help," she said. "If there's anything in the house, any files or documents she might have hidden, I can try to find them." He shook his head, a small smile breaking his otherwise somber expression. "You've done more than enough already, Lydia, but I trust you implicitly. If you do come across anything, please let me know." Their brief conversation ended with a mutual understanding, and Lydia felt a renewed sense of purpose as she returned to her tasks. Her mind was now finely tuned to the smallest details, alert for any opportunity to uncover Margaret's secrets. As the gathering wound down and guests began to depart, Lydia resumed cleaning, her eyes scanning the rooms for anything that might serve as a clue. Margaret's presence was a constant shadow, her eyes cold and unyielding whenever they passed each other in the hall. Finally, as the last guest bid farewell, Lydia headed toward the upstairs study, hoping to find something that might aid Edwin's cause. She'd never been one to intrude on private spaces. But tonight, her sense of duty outweighed her usual restraint. The study was dimly lit, its shelves lined with books, and a faint scent of leather lingered in the air. Lydia's eyes roamed over the desk, where stacks of papers lay in seemingly disordered piles. But she knew Margaret's methods were far from disorganized. Each stack, each document likely served a purpose, carefully arranged to create confusion. She approached the desk cautiously, her fingers brushing over a small notebook tucked into the corner. Before she could open it, however, a soft creak sounded behind her. Lydia's heart leaped into her throat as she turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face an unreadable mask. "Lydia," Margaret said slowly, her gaze like ice. "What exactly are you doing in my husband's study?" Lydia's mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm, hiding any sign of guilt. "I was cleaning up after the guests left, ma'am. Mr. Harper asked me to ensure everything was tidied before I finished my shift." Margaret's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her features. "Did he now?" "Yes, ma'am," Lydia replied, her tone steady, though her pulse pounded in her ears. "He takes great pride in his study, and I wanted to be sure it was perfect." Margaret's expression softened slightly, but there was still an edge to her gaze. "Of course. Very well then, but don't touch anything on the desk. Edwin's files are private, and I'd hate to think of anyone prying into things that don't concern them." Lydia offered a polite nod, keeping her face neutral as she backed out of the study, feeling Margaret's eyes following her every step. She left the room as gracefully as she could, her mind reeling from the close call. If Margaret had sensed her true intentions, it could have ended disastrously. As Lydia made her way back downstairs, she felt the weight of her promise to Edwin grow heavier. They were playing a dangerous game, one that required them to outwit Margaret at every turn. But she refused to let fear deter her. Edwin's life and legacy were at stake, and she was committed to seeing this through, no matter the risks. Later that night, as Lydia left the mansion and walked toward her home, the silence of the evening felt unusually tense. She glanced over her shoulder once, half expecting to see Margaret lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty, save for the quiet hum of distant city lights. Steeling herself for what lay ahead, Lydia reminded herself that she wasn't alone. She had Edwin's trust, his faith in her, and a purpose that went beyond mere employment. They were allies now, bound by loyalty and the pursuit of justice, ready to confront whatever dangers Margaret might throw in their path. The tension in the Harper mansion reached a boiling point over the next few days. Lydia could feel it in the way Margaret moved through the halls, her demeanor sharper and more calculating than ever. Margaret's gaze lingered on Lydia whenever their paths crossed, her eyes narrowing, her lips set in a thin line. It was only a matter of time before she made her next move, and Lydia could feel it like an approaching storm. Then, one evening, as Lydia was preparing hors d'oeuvres for a small dinner party Edwin had organized, she heard her name called from the grand foyer. Margaret's voice cut through the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, echoing through the halls. Lydia. Margaret's voice was as sweet as honey, but held a sharp undertone that immediately put Lydia on edge. She set down the tray she'd been arranging and made her way to the foyer. Where Margaret stood with a small group of Edwin's guests, the guest glanced at Lydia, curiosity mingling with confusion in their expressions. Margaret gave Lydia a tight smile. "There you are, Lydia. I've been looking everywhere for you. We seem to have a bit of an issue." Lydia's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "How can I help, Mrs. Harper?" Margaret held up a delicate silver bracelet, its intricate design sparkling under the chandelier lights. "I found this hidden in one of the pantries," she announced, her tone loud enough for the guests to hear. "It's one of my most valuable pieces. A gift from Edwin. I'm quite protective of it." The guests exchanged glances, their attention now fully on Lydia and Margaret. Lydia felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. Margaret had staged this moment to publicly humiliate her, to cast doubt on her character in front of Edwin and his guests. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Mrs. Harper," Lydia replied, her voice steady. "I've never seen that bracelet before." Margaret's expression shifted into one of exaggerated pity. "Oh, Lydia, I don't want to think the worst, but things do tend to go missing from time to time, and I can't help but wonder." She trailed off, letting her words hang in the air, each syllable crafted to imply guilt. Lydia's chest tightened. She could see the effect Margaret's words were having on the guests, their curious expressions turning wary, but she refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "I've never touched your things, Mrs. Harper," Lydia replied calmly. "I would never betray Mr. Harper's trust." Margaret's gaze hardened, but she maintained her smile for the guests. "Trust is a delicate thing, Lydia. Once it's broken, it's very difficult to repair." At that moment, Edwin entered the foyer, his expression puzzled as he took in the scene. His eyes moved between Margaret and Lydia, quickly picking up on the tension that filled the room. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Margaret turned to him, her face a picture of innocence. "Oh, Edwin, I was just explaining to Lydia how important this bracelet is to me. It went missing, and I found it in one of the kitchen pantries." Edwin's gaze shifted to Lydia, his brow furrowing. "Lydia, do you know anything about this?" Lydia met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "No, Mr. Harper. I've never seen that bracelet, and I have no idea how it ended up in the pantry." The guests watched, a silent audience to this uncomfortable exchange. Edwin's eyes lingered on Lydia, and she saw the trust he had in her, a quiet assurance that he wasn't swayed by Margaret's implications. He turned to his wife, his expression growing harder. "Margaret, it's possible the bracelet was misplaced," Edwin said, his tone diplomatic but with an edge. "Accidents happen, and I don't think it's fair to make any assumptions without clear evidence." Margaret's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she managed to keep her composure. "Of course, darling. I just wanted to make sure there's nothing to worry about." She turned back to Lydia, her eyes flashing with anger beneath her polite smile. "Lydia, you're dismissed for the evening." Lydia hesitated, feeling the sting of humiliation, but she nodded, not willing to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her affected. She turned and left the room, her steps steady as she retreated to the kitchen, the weight of the guests' stares pressing down on her. Once back in the kitchen, Lydia steadied herself, taking deep breaths to keep her emotions in check. She knew Margaret's tactic. She was trying to isolate Lydia, to make Edwin question her loyalty and undermine their growing alliance. But she also knew that Edwin saw through the manipulation, and that knowledge gave her strength. Minutes later, Edwin entered the kitchen, his expression filled with a mixture of frustration and concern. He approached her, his voice soft but resolute. I'm so sorry, Lydia. Margaret was completely out of line. Lydia gave a small nod, her voice steady. Thank you, Edwin. I appreciate you standing up for me. He shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. Margaret's behavior was unforgivable. She crossed a line tonight, and I won't let her continue treating you like this. Lydia felt a wave of gratitude, but chose her words carefully. Edwin, I don't want you to get caught in the middle of this. Margaret will only push harder if she senses resistance. Edwin's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Lydia, you've been nothing but loyal and honest, and I won't let her drag your name through the mud. Margaret may think she's in control, but I know who I can trust. They shared a brief, understanding look, and in that moment, Lydia felt the strength of their bond more than ever. Edwin wasn't just her employer. He was her ally, someone who genuinely valued her for who she was, not just as a cook. Thank you, she whispered, feeling a surge of resolve. I'll do everything I can to support you. We'll get through this. Edwin nodded, his hand lingering on her shoulder a moment longer before he stepped back. Go home, Lydia. Take the evening to rest. Tomorrow, we'll approach this with fresh minds. Lydia left the mansion that night, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. Margaret's attempt to humiliate her had left a bitter taste, but Edwin's unwavering trust renewed her resolve. She knew that Margaret wouldn't stop at a simple accusation. The woman was ruthless, willing to go to any lengths to protect her hold on Edwin and his wealth, but Lydia was no longer intimidated. She had faced Margaret's venomous accusations head-on, and while the sting still lingered, she knew she couldn't be broken so easily. As she walked home under the cool night sky, she felt the weight of her purpose settle over her. She was determined to see this through, to stand by Edwin and help him uncover the truth about his wife. And as she reached her modest home, she glanced back at the dark silhouette of the Harper mansion in the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she would be ready. Margaret had underestimated her, and Lydia was prepared to show her just how wrong she was. The next morning, Lydia returned to the Harper mansion with renewed determination. She had spent a sleepless night replaying Margaret's attempt to humiliate her, and strategizing ways to gather evidence of Margaret's deception. Edwin's trust was her anchor, and she intended to prove Margaret's guilt, not only for him, but to clear her own name. As Lydia entered the kitchen, she noticed an unusual quietness in the house. Edwin had mentioned plans for a quiet day, but something about the silence felt strange, almost foreboding. She pushed the thought aside and went about her tasks, focusing on the steady rhythm of her work. Mid-morning, Edwin found her in the kitchen, his expression serious but relieved to see her. Lydia, thank you for coming in today. I know things have been challenging. She offered him a warm smile. I'm here to help, Mr. Harper. Whatever you need. He glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered his voice. I have something to show you. I was looking through some old family records last night, and I came across something that might change everything. Lydia's curiosity piqued, and she followed him up to his study, where he closed the door behind them. On his desk lay an assortment of papers, aged and faded, with handwritten notes in the margins. Edwin picked up a small folder, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. These are old family documents, he explained, handing the folder to Lydia. I thought they were just financial records, but there's something strange about one of them. Lydia opened the folder carefully, her eyes scanning the first document. Her gaze stopped at a specific line, her heart skipping a beat. There, written in clear handwriting, was a name she knew all too well, her own mother's name. She glanced up at Edwin, her mind racing. Why is my mother's name here? Edwin's expression softened, a hint of sympathy in his gaze. Lydia, I think there's more to your connection with this family than either of us realized. Confusion swirled in Lydia's mind as she scanned the document more closely. Her mother's name was listed in a section about inheritances and family assets, and next to it, a note indicated a relationship with Edwin's father, a relationship that seemed far more significant than Lydia had ever imagined. Are you saying... Lydia's voice trailed off as the implication sank in. Her mother's name, the record of an inheritance. She was linked to the Harper family in ways she'd never dreamed possible. Edwin's voice was soft. It seems that your mother had a relationship with my father, Lydia. You and Margaret might be related. The words echoed in Lydia's mind, each syllable heavy with the weight of unexpected truth. She felt a surge of disbelief, her mind reeling at the revelation. Margaret, the woman who had tried to sabotage her at every turn, was her half-sister. No, that can't be, Lydia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. It doesn't make sense. Edwin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I understand this is a shock, but the documents don't lie. I believe that, somewhere in his past, my father had a relationship with your mother, and if that's true, then you and Margaret share a connection none of us anticipated. Lydia's thoughts raced as she tried to piece together this new reality. The idea of being connected to Margaret, even distantly, was unfathomable. But as the initial shock faded, Lydia felt a strange sense of clarity. This connection explained Margaret's hostility, her relentless need to undermine Lydia. Perhaps, on some level, Margaret had always sensed a connection and resented it. So, Margaret knew? Lydia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. Did she know about my mother? Edwin's expression turned grim. I suspect she might have known something. She's always been fiercely protective of her place in this family, and if she knew about your mother, she might have felt threatened by your presence here. Lydia nodded, understanding now why Margaret had been so determined to sabotage her. The truth wasn't just about wealth or status. It was personal, a rivalry rooted in family secrets. Margaret had likely viewed Lydia as an intruder, someone who threatened her claim to the Harper legacy. What do we do now? Lydia asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. Edwin paused, considering her question. This changes everything. Margaret has gone to great lengths to discredit you, but this connection, it makes her actions even more questionable. If she's been hiding this, who knows what else she's capable of? A spark of determination ignited in Lydia. She knew now that her role in the mansion went beyond her position as a cook. She was part of this family's history, for better or worse, and she couldn't allow Margaret to twist that history to serve her own ends. As she stood beside Edwin, a plan began to take shape in her mind. We need to confront her, Lydia said, her voice firm. We need to bring this out into the open, to expose everything she's done. Edwin nodded, his expression resolute. You're right. She's manipulated and lied, but she won't be able to deny this. If she's willing to harm her own family, then everyone deserves to know. They spent the next hour preparing, organizing the documents and deciding on their approach. Lydia felt a newfound strength as they worked side by side, an unbreakable alliance that she knew Margaret couldn't destroy. As the afternoon wore on, Edwin arranged for a private meeting with Margaret, requesting that she join him in the study. Lydia stood just out of sight, her heart pounding with anticipation. She knew this confrontation would change everything, but she was ready for the truth to come to light. Margaret arrived with her usual air of confidence, but a flicker of suspicion crossed her face as she glanced at Edwin's solemn expression. What's this about, Edwin? She asked, her voice laced with annoyance. Edwin gestured toward the documents on the desk. Margaret, I think it's time we discuss some family matters. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze shifting between Edwin and the documents. What family matters? Edwin motioned for Lydia to step forward, and as she entered the room, Margaret's expression shifted to one of contempt. Oh, so this involves her, does it? Yes, it does, Edwin replied firmly. Lydia has a right to know the truth about her connection to this family, and I believe you do too. Margaret's face hardened, but a flicker of something, perhaps fear, passed over her eyes as she looked at the documents in Edwin's hand. I don't know what you're talking about. Edwin held up the folder, his gaze unwavering. Lydia's mother and our father had a relationship, Margaret. This means Lydia is as much a part of this family as you are. Margaret's composure faltered, her expression twisting in a mixture of shock and anger. That's absurd. You're basing this on a few scraps of paper. Lydia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. It's more than a few scraps of paper, Margaret. I may not have known my mother's full past, but this is the truth, and if you've known about this, then you owe me an explanation. Margaret's mask slipped, revealing the venom lurking beneath. You're nothing but a servant, she spat. I am the rightful heir to this family. You're just an accident, a stain on our name. Edwin's voice cut through the tension, cold and unyielding. Margaret, that's enough. You've manipulated and controlled for far too long. But you can't erase family history. Lydia belongs here as much as you do. Margaret's face twisted with rage, her eyes blazing. This is my family, Edwin. My legacy. She's not one of us. But Edwin's expression was resolute. That's where you're wrong, Margaret. Lydia has shown loyalty and integrity, qualities you could stand to learn from. As Margaret stared at them, the weight of her lies and manipulation crashing down, Lydia felt a wave of liberation. For the first time, she saw Margaret's hold on this family beginning to unravel, the truth severing the chains of deceit Margaret had tried to bind her with, and Lydia knew that from this moment on, nothing in the Harper mansion would ever be the same. The silence in the study was thick with tension as Margaret's rage simmered. Her gaze darted between Edwin and Lydia, disbelief and fury flashing across her face. It was as if her world was crumbling, and she was grasping at any shred of control she could still find. So, that's it then. Margaret's voice was laced with venom, though it shook slightly as she spoke. You think you can strip away everything I've built here? Just like that? This woman? She means nothing. She's just a relic from a past that should have stayed buried. Lydia felt a surge of anger, but kept her expression calm. She wouldn't allow Margaret's words to unsettle her. She had the truth on her side, and she wouldn't let Margaret twist it. Edwin stepped forward, his voice cold and firm. Margaret, Lydia isn't some relic. She's family, whether you like it or not. And after everything you've done, you have no right to look down on anyone. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. Family? You think she's family? She's an intruder? Edwin? A nobody? You wouldn't even know about her if it weren't for me. Lydia's eyes narrowed. So, you did know, she said softly, piecing together Margaret's outburst. You knew about my mother, about my connection to this family, and you've been trying to push me out from the moment I arrived. Margaret scoffed, her gaze sharp and filled with resentment. Of course I knew. I've known for years. I was the one who kept that little detail hidden. You should be grateful I even let you stay in this house as long as I did. Edwin shook his head, disappointment clear in his eyes. Margaret, this obsession with control, it's gone too far. Lydia has been nothing but loyal, and you've treated her with cruelty. This isn't the woman I thought I married. Margaret's face twisted in anger, but Lydia saw a hint of something else beneath the fury. Fear. For the first time, Margaret's control was slipping, and she had no way to stop it. Don't you dare try to pin this on me. Edwin, Margaret hissed, her voice low. This family, this legacy, it's mine. You're letting this stranger drive a wedge between us. Lydia took a deep breath, her own emotions swirling inside her. She felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that she was finally confronting the truth of her past, yet seeing the damage it was causing. This isn't about driving a wedge, Margaret, Lydia said, her voice steady. This is about honesty and respect, something you seem to have forgotten. Margaret's gaze shot back to her, her eyes flashing. Respect. You think you deserve respect. You've lived a life of servitude. Lydia, you wouldn't understand what it means to hold power, to truly belong somewhere. Edwin stepped closer to Margaret, his face a mask of calm but firm resolve. Perhaps Lydia doesn't seek power the way you do. She seeks integrity, and that's something this family desperately needs. You've had every opportunity to show kindness and decency. Margaret, instead, you chose deceit and manipulation. Margaret's lips curled into a sneer. And yet, here I am, with everything you cherish. Your fortune, your reputation, and this mansion. Don't think for a moment that you can take that from me. But Edwin held her gaze, unflinching. Margaret, this isn't just about material things. It's about what kind of person you've become. I can't continue living a lie with someone who would destroy others just to hold on to her place in this family. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She faltered for a moment, her expression shifting from rage to something closer to desperation. Lydia almost felt a pang of pity. Almost. But the memory of Margaret's cruelty and schemes quickly tempered any sympathy. Margaret composed herself, straightening and lifting her chin. So, what now, Edwin? Are you going to cast me out? Tear apart this marriage because of her? Edwin's response was firm. This marriage was already damaged, Margaret. You did that the moment you tried to poison me, the moment you manipulated everything for your gain. I've given you every chance to come clean, and you've refused. I can't keep pretending this is a partnership when all you've done is deceive me." Margaret's face twisted with fury, her voice growing shrill. "You'll regret this, Edwin. You'll regret every word. This house, this family, it's nothing without me." Edwin held her gaze, unfazed. "Then go ahead, Margaret. Do what you must, but know that your time here is over. You can't hold on to this by force anymore." Lydia watched as the tension between them hung heavy in the air, Margaret's face darkening as she realized her grip on Edwin, and on everything she'd fought to control, was slipping through her fingers. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, Margaret turned on her heel and stormed out of the study, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she disappeared from sight. The room fell silent. Edwin exhaled, releasing a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He turned to Lydia, his expression filled with a mix of relief and regret. "Thank you, Lydia," he said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy, but I needed you here. You've shown me what it means to have real family by my side." Lydia felt her heart swell at his words, a warm sense of belonging washing over her. "I'll always be here for you, Edwin. Whatever you need, I'll be here." They shared a silent understanding, a connection that transcended words. Lydia knew that they still had a long road ahead, but they had crossed an important line together. With Margaret's schemes exposed and her power broken, the future felt brighter, filled with the promise of honesty and healing. Later that day, as Lydia went about her duties with a lighter heart, she saw Margaret gathering her belongings, her expression one of quiet fury. The woman who had once held the household in an iron grip now looked small, her anger a hollow shell of the authority she had tried to wield. As Margaret passed Lydia on her way out, she cast one last venomous glance in her direction. "Enjoy this while it lasts, Lydia. People like you don't belong here. You'll see that eventually." But Lydia met her gaze without fear. "People like me belong wherever they earn their place, Margaret. That's something you should have learned a long time ago." Margaret's face twisted with anger, but she said nothing as she turned and left, her footsteps fading as she exited the mansion for the last time. Lydia watched her go, feeling a profound sense of closure. Margaret's departure signaled the end of a dark chapter, and Lydia felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. She had faced her fears, uncovered the truth of her family, and reclaimed her dignity. As she returned to the study, Edwin greeted her with a soft smile. "She's gone," he said, almost in disbelief. "It's over." Lydia nodded, her voice calm. "Yes, it is. And now we can start fresh." They stood together in the quiet room, both feeling the magnitude of what they had overcome. For the first time, the Harper mansion felt like a place of peace, its shadows lifting as the truth filled every corner. In that moment, Lydia knew she had found her place, not just as Edwin's confidant, but as a true member of the Harper family. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. Together, they turned toward the future, ready to rebuild and reclaim what Margaret had tried to steal. The Harper legacy would endure, this time founded on truth, loyalty, and a bond that no lie could break. With Margaret gone, a quiet sense of relief settled over the Harper mansion. Lydia moved through the halls feeling an unfamiliar but welcome lightness, as though a storm had finally passed. Yet, she knew that despite Margaret's exit, there was still work to be done. The damage Margaret had caused couldn't simply be erased, and the rumors of her dramatic departure lingered among Edwin's business associates and friends. Edwin, too, seemed changed. In the days following Margaret's departure, he appeared more at ease, but a shadow of worry remained. He had made the difficult choice to sever ties with his wife, a decision that came with consequences, personal and financial. Margaret's schemes had left traces, small but significant, in the family's finances, and Lydia knew Edwin was grappling with the reality of repairing the harm she had caused. One evening, Lydia found Edwin in his study, reviewing paperwork with a furrowed brow. She knocked gently on the door, and he looked up, a faint smile breaking his concentration. "Lydia?" he greeted, gesturing for her to enter. "I'm glad you're here." She took a seat across from him, her gaze sweeping over the documents on his desk. "How are things looking?" she asked, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's complicated." Margaret was careful, but she wasn't perfect. We've uncovered unauthorized transfers, changes to investments, and a slew of unusual expenses that I wasn't aware of. It's going to take time to untangle everything." Lydia nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know this is difficult, but at least we're aware of the damage now. We can work on setting things right." Edwin gave her a grateful look. "You're right, and I couldn't have done this without you. If you hadn't spoken up when you did, well, I don't like to think where I'd be." They shared a brief, meaningful silence, both aware of how much they had endured together. Edwin's trust in her had proven unbreakable, and Lydia's loyalty had become the cornerstone of the mansion's new chapter. As the evening wore on, they discussed strategies for stabilizing the family finances, considering ways to discreetly reverse Margaret's meddling. Edwin spoke of hiring a trusted accountant to audit the records, but Lydia sensed there was still a part of him hesitant to bring others into the fold. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Lydia offered, determined to support him in any way she could. Edwin looked at her thoughtfully. "You've already done so much." "Lydia, but actually there is something. I need someone I trust to go through some of the remaining documents. Margaret was meticulous, and I'm certain there are things we haven't found yet." Lydia felt a surge of purpose. "I'll go through everything carefully. If there's anything hidden, I'll find it." Edwin nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Lydia. With you by my side, I feel like we can face whatever comes next." The following days were filled with long hours of meticulous work. Lydia spent hours in the study, sorting through files, piecing together the remnants of Margaret's schemes. She took detailed notes, identifying inconsistencies and tracing the path of missing funds. It was challenging, but with each discovery, Lydia felt a renewed sense of accomplishment. She was no longer just a cook in this mansion. She was a trusted partner, helping Edwin rebuild the foundation Margaret had tried to destroy. One afternoon, as Lydia reviewed a particularly complex file, she came across a letter addressed to Edwin from one of Margaret's former advisors. The letter mentioned an offshore account Margaret had set up, a hidden fund where she had siphoned significant amounts of money over the years. Lydia's breath caught as she read the details. Realizing the scale of Margaret's betrayal, it was far worse than they had anticipated. Taking the letter to Edwin, Lydia explained her discovery, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "This account, Margaret hid it well, but with the right authorities involved, we could possibly recover a portion of what she took." Edwin's face grew grim as he took in the information. "She went this far, and all for control, for power." He shook his head, a mixture of sadness and frustration clouding his expression. "But at least now, we know the full extent of her actions." With Lydia's support, Edwin contacted a trusted legal advisor to begin the process of recovering the funds. The road ahead was daunting, but Lydia knew that each step they took brought them closer to reclaiming what Margaret had stolen. Their alliance had proven stronger than Margaret's schemes, and Lydia felt a deep satisfaction in knowing they were undoing her deceit one evening. As they sat together in the quiet of the study, Edwin leaned back in his chair, regarding Lydia with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Lydia, I never imagined we'd come this far. You've done more than I ever could have asked for, and I can't begin to thank you enough." Lydia gave him a soft smile. "You don't need to thank me, Edwin. I've come to care deeply for this place, for everything it stands for. I believe we're doing the right thing." Edwin nodded, a warmth in his gaze that went beyond mere gratitude. "This mansion, it's more than just a home. It's a legacy, and with you here, I feel like we're finally restoring its true spirit." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. The future held uncertainties, but Lydia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had come to this mansion as a humble cook, yet she had found a purpose greater than she could have imagined. As the night drew on, Edwin stood and extended a hand to Lydia, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "We've come a long way, Lydia, and together, I believe we can restore everything that Margaret tried to destroy." She took his hand, feeling the weight of his trust and the promise of a shared future. "We will, Edwin. I know we will." With Margaret gone, Lydia and Edwin had forged a new beginning, one built on trust, loyalty, and a shared commitment to truth. And as they prepared for the final steps in their journey, Lydia knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it alongside Edwin, ready to protect and uphold the legacy they were building together. The Harper mansion had settled into a new rhythm in the weeks following Margaret's departure. With Lydia's help, Edwin had uncovered most of the hidden financial manipulations, and the process of restoring stability had begun. Yet, the feeling of finality remained elusive. Lydia couldn't shake the sense that Margaret had one last card to play. Her departure had been too abrupt, too unfinished. And she was right. One evening, just as twilight cast its long shadows across the mansion's polished floors, a visitor arrived at the front gate. Lydia, busy in the kitchen, heard the faint murmur of voices as Edwin greeted the unexpected guest. She couldn't see who it was, but Edwin's tense expression as he entered the study told her everything she needed to know. Margaret had returned. Curiosity mingled with apprehension as Lydia lingered near the hallway, close enough to hear the low rumble of their conversation without intruding. Edwin's voice was steady but laced with irritation, while Margaret's tone held a hint of desperation, something Lydia hadn't heard from her before. "I've come to talk," Margaret said, her voice carefully measured. "I think we both know this isn't over, Edwin." Edwin's response was calm but firm. "After everything you've done, Margaret, I don't see what there is left to discuss." There was a pause. Then Margaret's voice took on a pleading edge. "I may have made mistakes, Edwin, but I deserve a chance to make things right, for the sake of everything we once had." Lydia's breath caught. She knew Margaret's tactics well enough to recognize manipulation when she heard it. And this sudden turn from fury to regret was a performance crafted for Edwin's benefit. Edwin's voice dropped, filled with restrained anger. "You didn't just make mistakes, Margaret. You schemed, lied, and tried to poison me. You took advantage of every bit of trust I gave you. There's no way back from that." Lydia edged closer, listening as Margaret's voice took on a harder tone. "So that's it. Then, you throw me out, humiliate me, and strip me of everything I've worked for, all because of her." Lydia could almost feel Margaret's piercing gaze, her tone dripping with disdain. "This cook has bewitched you, Edwin. She's not family. She doesn't belong here." Edwin's response was swift, his voice ringing with conviction. "Lydia has shown more integrity and loyalty than you ever did. She belongs here because she's proven herself, not through bloodlines, but through character, something you wouldn't understand." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "How poetic, Edwin. But you're a fool if you think this is over. I have connections. Resources you wouldn't dream of. I could ruin you if I wanted to." A tense silence followed. Lydia's heart pounded as she anticipated what Edwin might say. She knew the strength of his resolve, but Margaret's words hinted at deeper threats, layers of influence that could jeopardize everything he had worked to rebuild. Finally, Edwin spoke, his voice controlled but filled with a quiet authority. "Margaret, you're no longer a part of this family. You're free to do as you please, but understand this. I will not be blackmailed or threatened. If you attempt to harm this family or anyone I care about, I will ensure that every one of your connections knows the truth about you. You won't find a shred of sympathy from them once they see what you've done." Margaret's tone shifted, a desperate edge creeping in. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect my place, to secure my future. Can't you see that? I was afraid." Edwin's voice softened slightly, but the distance remained. "If you were afraid, you should have come to me, not resorted to deception. It's too late for apologies, Margaret." The silence stretched, and Lydia felt the finality in Edwin's words. Margaret's presence, once a storm threatening to consume them all, was now reduced to a fading echo, a shadow of its former power. Lydia hoped that this would be the last time they'd hear from her. After a few more tense words, the heavy sound of footsteps marked Margaret's departure from the mansion. Lydia exhaled, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over her as the front door clicked shut behind Margaret for the last time. A few minutes later, Edwin found her in the hallway, his face weary but resolute. "She's gone, Lydia," he said, a trace of exhaustion in his voice. "For good this time." Lydia met his gaze, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "I know that wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Edwin offered a small smile, the weight of recent events evident in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." Margaret's influence. It ran deep, and for a long time I didn't see the truth. But you changed that. You helped me find clarity when I needed it most. They stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling around them. Margaret's departure marked the end of a dark chapter, one that had nearly destroyed the Harper legacy. Yet, through it all, Lydia had been there, her loyalty and courage a beacon guiding Edwin toward the truth. As they walked back to the study, Edwin placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder, a gesture of trust and respect. "There's one last thing we need to do," he said. "We need to ensure that this family's legacy is secure, that everything Margaret tried to destroy is restored." Lydia nodded, understanding the depth of his words. Together, they would continue their work, rebuilding the mansion's reputation and repairing the scars Margaret had left. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Edwin by her side, Lydia felt ready to face whatever came their way. In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly, contacting advisors, meeting with accountants, and reviewing every corner of the Harper estate. Slowly but surely, they began to restore order, each step a reminder of the resilience that had carried them through. And through it all, Edwin and Lydia's bond grew stronger. No longer just employer and employee, they had become partners, allies bound by trust and respect. Their shared history had forged a connection that neither of them could deny. One evening, as they finished the last of the paperwork in the study, Edwin looked at Lydia with a softness in his gaze. "Lydia, I don't think I've ever told you just how much you mean to this family. Not just to the mansion, but to me." Lydia felt a warmth spread through her, a gentle but undeniable realization of the depth of their relationship. "And you mean a great deal to me too, Edwin. I never expected to find this sense of belonging here, but it feels like home." Edwin reached out, his hand covering hers. "That's because it is home, Lydia, and you're a part of it, now and always." They shared a quiet smile, a silent promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mansion, once a place filled with secrets and shadows, had been transformed into a true home, a place where honesty and loyalty were cherished above all else. As they left the study that night, side by side, Lydia felt a profound sense of peace. The Harper legacy was secure. The truth had triumphed over deceit, and the bonds they had forged would endure for years to come. And in that moment, Lydia knew that she had found more than just a job in the Harper mansion. She had found her family. The days following Margaret's departure and the restoration of the Harper legacy were marked by a new, tranquil rhythm in the mansion. Sunlight filtered through the grand windows, casting warm beams across the rooms that once felt heavy with secrecy and mistrust. Now, the house felt alive, renewed with a sense of peace and promise. Lydia moved through her duties with a lightness that had been absent before. No longer merely the cook, she had become a valued presence in Edwin's life, a confidant, and, dare she admit it to herself, a friend and partner. As she moved through the kitchen, preparing for a small dinner Edwin had arranged for a few close friends, she felt content, for the first time in a long time. The mansion truly felt like home. That evening, as the guests arrived, Lydia took quiet satisfaction in the meal she had prepared. The aroma of roasted herbs and spices filled the dining room, mingling with the gentle laughter and conversations of Edwin's guests. Each guest expressed their delight in her cooking. But it was Edwin's quiet smile and nod of approval from across the room that filled her with the most pride. As the evening drew to a close and the last guest departed, Edwin found Lydia in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the evening's meal. He approached her, a soft smile on his face, gratitude evident in his expression. "Lydia," he said, his voice gentle, "you've done so much for this family, more than I could ever repay. This house wouldn't be the same without you." She looked up, warmth flooding her cheeks. "I'm just doing my part, Edwin. This place, it's become more than just a job to me." He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's become more than a home to me too, thanks to you. I feel like I've found a sense of belonging I didn't even realize was missing." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Finally, Edwin took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. Pulling out a small, intricately carved wooden box, he extended it toward her, his eyes warm. "This is for you," he said softly. Lydia accepted the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate necklace, a single elegant pendant hanging from a fine chain. The pendant was simple yet beautiful, a small, intricately crafted piece that shimmered in the light. "It belonged to my mother," Edwin explained, his voice soft. "She was a woman of strength, someone who believed in family above all else. When I look at you, Lydia, I see that same strength. I see someone who's become a part of this family in a way I never expected, overcome with emotion. Lydia felt a lump rise in her throat. Edwin, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, he replied with a gentle smile. Just know that you belong here, and that you're a part of this family no matter what. Lydia fastened the necklace around her neck, her heart swelling with gratitude. She looked up at Edwin, the weight of his words settling warmly within her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity, for everything. In the days that followed, Edwin and Lydia worked side by side, continuing to rebuild the mansion's legacy and strengthen the bonds that now held them together. Edwin introduced her to his closest associates as not just a valued employee, but as someone who had helped him reclaim his life. Lydia became more than just a figure in the background. She was a trusted partner, someone whose voice held weight and respect within the household. Over time, their relationship deepened. Moving beyond words or titles, they shared quiet dinners in the study, long conversations by the fireplace, and moments of laughter that felt like small victories after the hardships they'd faced. Edwin's gratitude and warmth toward her grew into a genuine companionship, a connection that neither had expected, but both had come to cherish. The Harper Mansion, once marred by secrets, had transformed into a place of genuine warmth and trust. Lydia's presence brought a new kind of light to the halls, one that filled every corner with hope and peace. The servants, too, sensed the shift, moving with a newfound energy and pride as they went about their work. Lydia's influence had breathed life into the mansion, creating an atmosphere that was inviting and full of promise. One bright afternoon, as Lydia stood by the large bay window in the library, gazing out at the expansive gardens, Edwin joined her. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the sunlight danced across the lawn. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Edwin murmured, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Lydia nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "Yes, it is. I never thought I'd find a place like this." Edwin turned to her, his eyes warm. "You've made this place what it is, Lydia. Without you, I don't know where I'd be." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, each reflecting on the journey they had taken together. Lydia felt a sense of completeness, of belonging, that she had never experienced before. "I'm just glad to be here," she replied softly, "and I'm grateful for everything we've been through. It's made this place real." They stood together, watching as the sunlight began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the gardens. The future stretched out before them, filled with endless possibilities, and a newfound sense of purpose. As night fell over the Harper Mansion, Lydia and Edwin remained by the window, a shared promise lingering in the air. They had faced the darkness together, confronted the shadows of the past, and emerged stronger, bound by loyalty, respect, and something that went deeper than either had anticipated. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, Lydia knew that her journey had led her exactly where she was meant to be, home,